Hello everyone and welcome back to Mondays on Mondays. This is the CDH Dad and
the CDH Warrior.
And once again, we're starting off your week with Mondays on Mondays. We started this because, you know, the negativity of Mondays, the beginning of the week, but it's also when our name happens to be Monday, so it ties together.
And this also came about because myself and my dad are involved in a number of groups dealing with children with rare disorders.
Social support groups in that.
Yeah.
And part of the reason I wanted to get involved with this is because a lot of times it's a matter of how the family is involved in this. And in our case, it's very unique in the fact that my son was congenital diaphragmatic hernia, CDH, unexpectedly when he was born. And we went through that. And then just a few years later, my daughter, who's 2 years younger, at the age of 18 months, was diagnosed with aplastic anemia and required a stem cell transplant, bone marrow transplant. And that was chemo, radiation, a lot of treatments there. And because of that, we have a lot of experience in the interactions and the difficulties that are involved with having children that have medical special requirements and special needs, and how can you blend that into being a normal family. And so that's the reason that we did this as a spin-off of some other things that my son does. So that's the main focus. The disclaimer we have is that we are not medical professionals, we're not psychologists, we're not therapists, we're not sociologists, none of that. We are just people who have had to, for the last almost 3 decades, live through the experience. And we want to be able to discuss some of what we see from our experience, but then also bring in some items that we're seeing from some of the social media groups that we're involved with, so that we can have an open discussion on some of these items. So I think that kind of gives the general introduction and the beginning of this. So
with that, let's roll the title.
Welcome back again to Mondays on Mondays. As we've discussed in the past, what we try and do is kind of pick our topics and discussions from what we're seeing in a lot of the social media and interactions, things like that. We also have an email address so that you can contact and bring questions or topics that may be of interest there. And one of the topics we've discussed, I think, several times in the past has been about a lot of the interaction we deal with in the social media are families that are in the early stages, just diagnosed with a child with a medical condition, and trying to figure out how to handle those unknown questions of little things. About, you know, what do I need to do to prepare for this child? What do I need to take to the hospital? What do I need to expect from the doctors? Those type of things. And some of those, we're not going to try and get into the details on that. But one of the other things that we pick up is that, particularly in children under 5, we are all geared towards the milestones that we see. And I was actually talking with a family member a few weeks ago about the fact of, you know, pediatricians came out with a table of milestones of what to expect your child, and when they would be talking, when they'd be saying certain words, when they would be crawling, walking, self-feeding, all of these various aspects of what to expect, because new parents are always wondering, okay, is my child okay? Is everything fine? Are they doing all right? And the milestone guide was just put together as a rough guideline. to use to see where you are. And many, go ahead.
A lot of people want to put that as the Bible for development, not just developmental. I'm going to go developmental psychology, but also developmental pediatrics.
Right.
That everyone wants to refer back to that. And really, what you should do is kind of throw that out, not completely toss it to the side, but don't focus so much on it.
Right. It's one, for the most part, and this is what I've brought out, I think some here, but a lot of times in comments and interactions I've had with people who've asked these things is, ask your pediatrician, do you see anything out of line? Do you have any issues or concerns there? This last week was a lady who was concerned because of verbal skills with a child. And, I went back and said, first thing, talk to your doctor or your therapist or whoever and see, do you see any hearing issues? Are there any questions there? Are there any concerns there? Has the doctor seen any physical issues that could cause problems with communications? And as a sideline is, we had, my wife and I had friends that had 3 boys, and the youngest boy was almost about 3.5, 4 years old before he really spoke and said his first word. And we were one Friday night just gathering together as friends. The doorbell rang and his first word was pizza. And it's like, oh, I said something. He had 2 older brothers. He said they always took care of everything for it. He never worried about having to talk about things. So he was honest about it. He didn't necessarily have to talk. Everybody took care of everything for him. So you've got to kind of look at the aspects from that standpoint.
Yeah.
One of the things I brought out,
okay, go ahead.
No, one of the things I brought out this last week with the one that had the issue over the verbal skills is that I'm not trying to use the term that if you have the medical conditions early, your child is not normal. Your child is exceptional because these children have had to overcome things that most children hopefully will never have to experience. Mm-hmm. If you've had the time where you've had to spend a week or 2 on an ECMO machine, which is basically a heart-lung bypass for your child, if you've had to take your child through chemo and radiation, if you've had to, look at, say, well, okay, we're on our 12th surgery with my child, that child is not necessarily going to be on the same timetable of a child who has spent their day just there with their parents and nothing else going on and no unusual circumstances. Mm-hmm. These are children that have to go above and beyond in a lot of cases. And from that, their development is not necessarily going to be on the same timetable with other children. So you can't necessarily use a guideline and a rule. One of the things we will be bringing up at a later topic, and I just saw this information from a friend, but she's involved in early childhood intervention, which is when you have a child that is not fitting a lot of those milestones and evaluating what the components are, what the concerns are, what the issues are with that. And a lot of times these are not children that have had medical issues in the past, but some things that are of concern that need to be addressed. And part of what I saw was basically a discussion of you need to work on the team that you have available to help in the development with your child.
Yeah.
The first and foremost is the parents and the family that are involved. And how are you interacting? What are you seeing? What are you picking up from that? How are you involved in that child's life? But it's also one you need to talk with, if you've got a therapist or a preschool teacher, your physicians, things like that. Open discussions on that. But, what are things that are being seen? How are you dealing with those? What can you pick up? I mean, there are simple tests. If you've got a child that you're concerned about their verbal skills, can you rattle something behind them and do they detect that it's there? It's a fairly simple hearing test to see, okay, is there something going on? You look at the visual and seeing, okay, if I move something, do they see that? Do they notice that movement? Those type things. Do you go outside and do they see the changes in the clouds or something like that? Little things that you need to watch over time.
Yeah.
But one of the things my son and I were just recently discussing is that a lot of times, particularly in children that we're talking about that have the severe medical issues and the interventions that have had to be made on the medical standpoint, is that the guideline of these children have had to experience a lot that other children haven't had to experience, but it's also one, there's not a lot of knowledge known on that. When my son was born, it was, we were hoping for a 30 to 40% chance of survival. That was the rate at that time. And from that meant that most of the kids that had this type of condition didn't survive. Yeah. And those that did survive were those that typically had a lesser degree and a lesser severe issue with that. It's the same with a lot of other children that have a lot of medical, physical issues, defects, birth defects that impact. Medical technology has expanded tremendously in the last 2 and 3 decades in the capabilities of what the medical community can do and help these children survive. But we're still in the early phases of how do we handle the impact of that? How do we handle the development of those things? And I go back because I am part of the baby boomer generation. Yeah. And we did not have a lot of the special ed systems in our schools. We did not have a lot of children that had disabilities involved in our schools. And a lot of this was a fact of the majority were not surviving because there were not the medical capabilities at that time. Yeah. And there was also not the social norms and the social acceptance of a lot of these things. So we didn't necessarily have those interactions. I'm very happy now that we have a lot more diversity in our school systems, and we're going through these things. So you've got to figure out, how do you deal with your child's unique situation? And the one thing I've told my son on some occasions recently is, we kind of base on that normal childhood development and the normal adolescent. And if we really start looking at this from the statistical standpoint, and I'm an engineer by background, so I look at a lot of these type of things, but we kind of go towards that center of the bell curve. Yeah. And these are normal, but when you really get into it, that statistically should only be about 1/3 of the population. Yeah. And then you're going to have another third that's above and another third below. And it depends. Another third that's on this side and another third that's on that side. Not exceptional or delayed or whatever that is, but different, not in what you consider that main third. And how do we deal with and impact that and consider that? And an interesting side note, as we were talking about the topic earlier, was I saw a segment talking about Elon Musk, and Elon Musk is one of those, I think most people have heard of him, kind of know of him between SpaceX, Tesla, Starlink, a lot of the businesses that he's developed. He started out doing PayPal, which was basically just a computerized payment system back when internet and a lot of the commerce there was just in its infancy. But as part of this is one, people either love or hate this man, but he relates to the fact that he grew up not accepted in the norm because he has Asperger's. He doesn't quite fit in that normal situation. Now, is he exceptional? Is he deficient? Who knows one way or the other? You may agree or disagree on that standpoint. But it's a factor of this is someone who is not in that normal line, but has done extremely well in the direction he is. Along those same lines is a lot of doctors, particularly doctors that are skilled surgeons and at that level, or businessmen who are very good at developing and building businesses, tend to be more on that neurological stream of Asperger's or borderline autistic, savant, whatever that is, because there's a different thought pattern and a different progress. And that's where we get to the point where we question, is that normal or is that not? You know, something you had to say?
Well, I was going to point out something, and as we were going through this, something just popped in my head. Even though we're discussing these exceptional people with Asperger's, ADHD, things like that, I wanted to point out that's not the normal in any way.
Yeah.
Because I think everyone's... When did the film Rain Man come out? Late 90s?
In the 90s, yeah.
Everyone, when they hear autism, Asperger's, things like that, they think of Rain Man and the savant level.
Yeah.
And that's not always the case. Because I've seen so many people that they hear about autism, ADHD. You get the picture. But they're like, oh, you're savants. No, not all of us are savants. That's not the normal with everything.
Yeah. But it's also one, I mean, like I said, I go back to the baby boomer generation, and you had children that were more disruptive in the classroom and needed additional discipline, support, whatever that was, to stay still in their seats and those type of things. That's before we had a lot of the medications and those type of things. So these are things that we have to work through in this. And part of the reason we kind of brought that up is that, you know, you've got to talk with your village, your community, the people that you deal with. In many cases, that's the family unit, which are the children, the parents, the grandparents, the brothers and sisters, and those ends. And in many cases, you're going to have open and honest discussions about how can you best do what you need to help your child in the situations they need to be. Not necessarily to make them do exactly what you expect other children to do, but find the things that will help them develop and be who they are and grow and meet the milestones longer term that they need to hit in terms of their development and where they're going to be. And get past the norm of, well, we're going to go through school, we're going to graduate high school, we're going to go to college, you know, you're going to get married, you're going to have kids, those type of things. But what is considered the normal access there? As a matter of fact, it was a discussion this week that I had with a family member of, well, you know, kids should, you know, finish school, and then as they become adults, they buy a house and they do these things. Well, that is a great idea until you start talking that you're talking $450,000 to buy a house right now. And most kids are not going to finish high school, trade school, college, whatever, and be able to have the money to do those type things. So what do we consider the new normal based on the way conditions are at this time? And how do we work in terms of being a parent and developing our children and helping them to be the best that they can be? And that's part of the reason we wanted to have this weekly discussion, is to bring some of these topics up. and looking at it for the long term. As I said, when we deal with this in the social media and those items, most of the people we're dealing with are people that are dealing with the early childhood phases. And in typical, these children get into the mainstream, get into normal, and by elementary school, middle school, there's nothing different. I mean, physically, there's nothing different from you than other kids if they don't see all the scars and the issues there. So you get into that mainstream, but it's also these are people that have had early experiences that will impact them their lifelong. In some cases, depending on conditions, your child has at later times, if they have a medical condition, a reherniation, or some issue related to a side effect, graft versus host disease, whatever it is, that impacts their lives later on, once they are at a point where they are at an age that they can realize that, is how does that impact them in terms of things like post-traumatic stress disorder, those type of things, and the concern that they're going to have long-term. So those are the top topics that we want to have and discuss in this. And we'll pick those up at later points in time. But was there anything else that you had?
Not necessarily.
Okay. If not, thank you for your attention, and we appreciate you being with Mondays on Mondays once again. Have a great week.
See you next time.